This is gonna sound interesting when taken out of context. So I'm just not that critical of a guy, right? Like criticizing things is easy.
That's the pull quote. Oh my God. Hello, welcome back to What's Left of Philosophy. I'm William. Here with me today is Gil.
Hello.
Owen.
Hey.
And Lillian.
Hi.
Today we have a very special episode for you all. We, after doing our Donna Haraway episode that comes out right before this episode, if you listened, we ended up talking quite a bit about science and climate change. And as a group, we decided we need to go to an expert to talk about all things climate, politics, security, etc. So I'm very excited to let you all know that today we have Professor Olúfẹ Táíwò from Georgetown University. Thank you, Olúfẹ.
Hey, glad to be here.
So Professor Táíwò, or for the purposes of this podcast, if it's okay, I'm gonna just call you Femi, if that's all right.
Yep.
He is an assistant professor at Georgetown. His work draws from the Black radical tradition, anti-colonial thought, and German transcendental philosophy, amongst contemporary social science, history of activism, activist thinkers. He is, I believe, reconsidering reparations. His manuscript will be coming out of Oxford University Press. Today, we're going to be discussing issues dealing with climate justice, climate colonialism, or climate imperialism, generally understood. Femi shared with us 4 more public-facing articles that we will have listed that he has written on these. And so I don't want to talk too long, but I will say that, when I reached out to Femi to ask him to come on, I said I really did, at least in the beginning, want to focus on the African continent. It seems that if we're going to talk about climate politics, we need to talk about at least how colonial relations or neo-colonial relations are reconfigured there presently, what we can expect in the future as it concerns migration politics and security politics. And it seems to me it's very important to, kind of center the African continent, because in many ways, the effects of climate change and these global politics are really laid bare out there. So as a way of jumping in, I'd like you to say a little bit, Femi, about, so you've used the phrase climate colonialism or climate apartheid. What do you mean by that, and what relationship does that have to present-day African countries?
So climate apartheid and climate colonialism, for me, are more or less the same concept, but just worked out at different scales. So if you look at maybe a national context or a community context, and you ask the question, how is climate change going to reconfigure social relations, right? How is it going to intensify class antagonisms? How is it going to intensify the gaps between the haves and the have-nots? And I think most importantly, how is it going to redefine what being a have versus a have-not means? And what people have pointed to under the heading of climate apartheid is increasingly that as climate crisis accelerates, the gap between haves and have-nots is going to be caused and increasingly characterized by how people are able to insulate themselves from the worst effects of climate crisis, or fail to insulate themselves from the worst effects of climate crisis. A really stark example of this are heat waves, such as the ones that have happened in Europe over the past decade or so, the ones that are likely to happen. Having access to reliable energy and air conditioning in the context of a heat wave would be literally an existential difference, right? And as the pace of those things accelerates, we will come to see debates over energy security and energy access take on a much different political form than they take on now in the present tense. Climate colonialism is just the same insight, but considered geopolitically. So relationships between countries, relationships between indigenous nations and the nearby settler states, I think, are also going to increasingly express themselves in terms of this basic political difference. Who has to bear the costs of climate crisis and who bears the burdens of adapting to a world with a different climate, of reaching global climate targets, et cetera, et cetera.
One of the pieces you sent us here was a piece on land acquisition on the African continent, and I believe private corporations and even maybe some nations are buying up land in Africa. How do you see this affecting the geopolitics and also the relationship of security as it concerns material subsistence for people on the African continent?
I think the situation is pretty dire, and I'm alarmed at how slow recognition of that situation is. So here are some of the bare facts. After the global financial crisis of 2008, there was a spike in commodity prices that sent capital flying across the world. And one of the things that capital went into was acquiring land, arable land, which is the basis of food security because you can cultivate on it, but also importantly, other forms of resource security. Land acquisitions are key to water access. And a lot of the land that was acquired by these large-scale land acquisitions was actually used for the growth of biofuels. So it's also playing a substantial role in energy security. The extent to which land ownership was consolidated under this capital flight is pretty considerable across the world, but I think nowhere is the situation more dire than on the African continent. By some estimates, a quarter of all the arable land is now owned under these large-scale land acquisitions. That's going to include pension funds, it's going to include local elites, it's going to include private industries, so on and so forth. And it's going to increasingly decide land use politics, which in turn is going to decide energy security, food security, and water security for the continent. And history has not been reassuring on, what amount of largesse African populations can expect from large landowners.
If I could jump in, we're talking about things like energy, food, and water security. And in a number of the pieces that you sent us, you make a distinction between two concepts of security that I think is really interesting and important. So on the one hand, there's something like an antagonistic security, which you sometimes describe as like a security from. And then there's also this sort of a collaborative security or like a security with, which is a more positive sort of communal and productive way of thinking about what security could mean for, liberatory political projects. Could you help unpack this distinction a little bit and talk about what's at stake in it?
So the security from the antagonistic security, it's the kind of security that people have by way of a barbed wire fence patrolled by armed guards, right? The kind of security that is generated through precarity to other people. So the basic way of conceiving of other people, at least people outside the zone of security on this model, is as threats, right? As people that security has to be essentially taken from. And I think there's a connection, historically speaking, between the ways that the global system of politics and economics was set up and this form of security. It's the kind of security that the planter elite had from the enslaved people that built their fortune. And that, I think, played a substantial role in building the world order. And it's the kind of security that much of the international system, I think, relies on in a much different way, militarily speaking, right? So the kind of security that comes from being able to project force from anywhere on the globe, which is the US's national security strategy, right? Or integral to the US's national security strategy. That obviously is one approach and one that I've not made sound very good. That's because I don't think it's very good. I think it sucks.
Thank you for getting to the punchline. What does
we do
an
not
antagonistic security? Is he a Schmittian?
Thumbs down.
Let's find out.
2 out of 5 stars would not recommend.
Yeah, do not recommend.
I love how, like, if we were at an analytic philosophy conference, it would be like, well, this argument, antagonistic security, well, it would go something like this, and then, but one might say that this is evil. So, an alternative view is something like this.
Stay tuned to my next paper for the normative argument, though.
Right.
Right. If you were a jerk, you'd pick antagonistic security. Alternatively, if you were fucking cool, what you would pick is
really
the
all
other
we
form
want
of security.
Use virtue signaling to our analytical advantage. If you're uncool, you will be on this team. But there's good normative reasons for that. But you should also be invested in the cool, which is over here.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
And so the cool is collaborative security. Right.
Hell yeah.
The cool
and
kids
this is
are up to.
Cool kids, right? And this is the kind of security we're bungling right now. But it's the kind of security that, say, an egalitarian distribution of vaccines might provide, where the very thing that makes me safe is the distribution that makes you safe, right? It's the successful non-eugenics version of herd immunity, right? Where
Yes, it's important to emphasize the non-eugenics.
Precisely, yeah. I used to be able to just say herd immunity, and then the last year happened, and now I have to.
Yeah, you're talking about the cool herd immunity.
Yeah,
precisely. Exactly.
Yeah.
Cool herd immunity, and I think that's the place where I'm hoping. That's the place where climate politics could go, and my investment in things like the Green New Deal or a global Green New Deal is exactly this, right? Getting away from doom and gloom, and also getting away from, I think, unhelpfully oppositional climate politics, and going towards the more abolitionist thought, on Gilmore's version, right? Abolition is a presence, right? Abolition is what you have when people have what they need. I think that's the ethos for collaborative security-based climate politics.
One of the things I really appreciate about your work is the way that you tie, like your way of doing materialist analysis ties these global distribution issues and global power networks to more local ones. Because it's you gave the example of vaccines when you talked about collaborative security, but elsewhere you give the example of like community control over policing. And you specify it's community control over policing, not community policing, which is a PR stunt, basically, to try to whitewash, to try to make it appear as if things have changed, even though the decision-making and the power centers of policing haven't changed whatsoever, right? That's, I think, one of the goals of a lot of these attempts to kind of capture what the anti-police energies of, activists have been bringing. So yeah, I wonder if you could just say maybe something about how you jump so very adeptly between these kind of global systems of power and then these kind of local systems of power, and then you index a kind of praxis, a kind of emancipatory practice to both of those kinds of levels.
Yeah, I wish I could say it that well. But that's exactly the thought, right? I mean, I have a core set of commitments, and collaborative security and finding ways to be for it is one of those commitments. But I think the way that these things are getting tied together in my head is maybe best explained as a political perspective on which they aren't separated in the first instance, right? So, one thing we could mean by materialism, right? A material analysis of society is like there's a bunch of stuff, land, property relations. Are property relations themselves material? But we could just say, well, give me a list of things and I'll pick the things on that list which sound material-y, and I'm not going to listen to you if you talk about anything else on the list, right?
Materials, I love that.
And I don't know. I obviously that's not my position, but that's I think that is a fairly coherent enough way of talking about materialism. But, when I say things like racial capitalism, when I say things like systemic oppression, systemic patriarchy, systemic racism, whatever, I'm just saying something literal about the social structure. I'm saying, like, there is an arrangement here of power, of institutions, and the way that these things relate to each other. And I'm just describing that actual structure. And so there isn't another thing I could mean by ending systemic racism other than making different institutions or different relationships between institutions, so on and so forth. And so when I describe what kinds of changes I'd like to make to that structure, then, I can talk about things like, principles, and I can talk about the normative and so on and so forth. And there's an important role for that, right? Because we could obviously make things worse. But I'm just not, there isn't a separate normative land where the idea of collaborative security exists. It's just a description of a different way of arranging these things that we need in the world, whether they're systems, whether they're distributions of resources, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's great. So, because it's not just, I think, like analytically important that you do that. I think if you don't show how these processes play themselves out at a kind of local level, it becomes so daunting that I think a lot of people get really cynical about what emancipatory practices would look like, right? If you're just facing global structures and you can't locate where you live down, on your block or, in your neighborhood, how these global power structures are affecting and shaping your life, it becomes very hard to oppose. And so I don't know, I really, really appreciate that gesture. And you do that in the security piece too, where you give the example of that woman, 𝙁𝙤𝙙𝙬 and you start out with her experience of poverty in the favela and her way of connecting it to global systems of power and to a material situation, not to, necessarily a set of people that are responsible.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think it's important for, people to understand what's at stake with these kinds of distinctions. But I also think maybe as like a corollary to that, or just another thing that comes out of that importance, is just the fact that if we don't define in real, concrete, systemic terms what anti-racism or anti-patriarchy or anti-ableism means, what we're saying is that this system that we just described as bad is what we're relying on to decide for us what those things mean. And I just think that's an egregious political error. And the complicity of academics in making that political error is bad. Thumbs down.
Not good.
Not cool. Not cool.
Again, not cool.
Okay, hold on. I actually want to back up because I feel like what you said was really good, but I'm not sure I got it. So were you saying that academics have a habit of not being concrete about the things, like when they describe these things in abstract terms, conceptually, they don't actually have in mind like a concrete set of institutions or distributions that they are attributing to those things, and therefore they don't think about the way in which they, like a concrete set of things that they would like to change, and that creates like a very bad displacement.
Yeah, I think a lot of times the way that academics engage in relating to the demands social movements are making, that is in a way that either further obscures or fails to clarify what the concrete upshots of these different protests could be, right? So, I'm just envisioning a role where, like, it's work, it's hard work, and it's very difficult to understand systems, and none of us could do it individually, right? We have to rely on each other to,
Right.
Point out things that we missed, or et cetera, et cetera. But one role that academics as a group could be playing is to, take up that particular share of the vast amounts of labor that's going to take to make a different world out of this one, right? So we could make it our business, instead of just saying, oh, the people who are criticizing this structure are right. We could be like, here is a version of a different structure entirely, or here's a different version of this structure, or, here's another thing we could do. Here's another way society could be concretely, not just at the level of principles or vibes, but here's some actual shit we could do to like remove the thing people are criticizing from the world and make a better one. And I think we don't do that enough.
Yeah. Yeah, the vibification of so much academic work that wants to be a part of this. I think in many ways this has happened, and I'm talking about a piece that we didn't read for you, but I think all of us are familiar with your elite capture essay, where
I love that essay.
The role of academics can be yes, actually let me speak for these people and translate for you what they are actually saying, which is usually something like when people are protesting the police, what they mean is, it really bums me out when I get on a plane as a Black person and they don't assume I'm going to go to first class. Like, what's that about? Let's burn it all down. And by that, I mean, give me first class tickets. Like, that's not helpful. That's not helpful. I mean, like, I don't know, like, give me first class tickets. So, now I've made it.
When in fact, of course, the truly revolutionary position is that there should be no difference between first class and coach. Right? That's it.
True.
Actually, it's that we're all first class. That yeah.
Wow. Yeah, well, that's the rhetorical.
Yeah.
That's how you sell
that
it.
We all get little crystal salt shakers with our evening meal on the plane. That's really what my political goals are.
That's all we want. That's all we want. But I don't want to take us like too far afield, but I think about this because obviously, a lot of us know you even on Twitter, and the way conversations around anti-racism either get turned into defanged critiques, or it's turned into this amorphous blob that people would rightfully say, so what is the point of anti-racism? Either it seems omnipresent or it designates nothing. And so what I thought was really great in your article on security around the Brazilian woman who wrote that autobiography, I want to ask you, one, why was it important for you? Because I noticed that you wrote this specifically, quote, that she didn't share middle-class norms of respectability, or, quote, she had politics that often diverged from tidy progressivism. Why was it important for you to point that out? Because the way this is connected in my head is, I think also sometimes there's this mistake of I'm sticking with anti-racist because I also work on race. There must be these perfect, morally pure subjects who we can point to and say, we are simply speaking their truth. They already know. Or, here is our model. Why was it important for you to say that, in essence, when you're focusing on this Black woman, that she shows us a lot about not just local problems, but, global structures around security, but, also that it wasn't like she was saying, and here's what capital is doing. Why was it important for you to show this reality of this?
Yeah, oh man, there's so much I want to say. So there is a new, it's not new, but there is a newly ascendant political tendency that I'm just, for lack of a better term, labeling the no redistribution, just vibes group. No, that's the proper response.
Yeah.
And yeah, I really liked the vibification, because I think what I was resisting there is a few things. One, like, I'm talking about this working class person who lives in informal settlement in Brazil, right? And I think what I was trying to get people to see is that the move I'm making is not an appeal to her moral authority as someone who's very oppressed, right? She is making an intellectual statement. I'm dealing with it as such, right? I think she had a thought. I think that thought was intelligent. I think that thought communicates something that is worth looking at as a thought. And so that was one of the points I was trying to make there. But the other point I was trying to make there, which is, I think, maybe just a different way of looking at this same point, is that what it would take to really do her thought justice, if we thought that she was correct, that freedom consisted in material security, and so we need social systems that provide material security. Doing that isn't a matter of like uplifting her voice as a person, right? I just happened to have a question that involved doing that when writing this essay. But like the point isn't you should know Carolina Maria de Jesus's name and you should read her book, right? You should, because it's a good book. But like that, that isn't the thing that would constitute responding to the intellectual thing that she said politically, right? And both of those are subtle ways that the point, that political points, political subjects, political agendas get shifted, right? And I think elite capture is, that's the description I'm going with so far for the process of how and why those discussions get shifted to whose voice we lift up, who we treat as having moral authority, et cetera, et cetera. Not that those aren't relevant at all, but that, those are different from the intellectual conversation that I was having with her and Isaiah Berlin through this essay.
So that's great, right? Because it's a really narrow path I think I see you trying to walk, but I think you've got to be right that it's not as though there isn't any political content to these discursive questions of whose voice we're listening to, who we're paying attention to, who we grant epistemic or moral authority. But that there's also a different level of political content at the level of what it is that these people are actually saying. And so, right, elite capture on this sort of way that you describe it is kind of like ignoring the political content of the claim she's making and making the political thing to do, elevating the voice while ignoring what that actual substantive political content is, right? I also really liked the language that you used, and I don't know if it was in this piece or I think it was in the other one, on elite capture, where you talk about like a deference epistemology as being like one of the, like, let's call it like depoliticizing or idealistic ways of interpreting what's going on with standpoint theory. I'm fascinated by this because I see like people talking about standpoint theory, especially online, in like very pejorative terms. And this always sort of confuses me because I think that it's an extremely powerful theoretical framework, and often positions are attributed to it that I don't see when I actually like pick up 𝙁𝙁𝙁𝙗, for instance, who like, outlines the feminist standpoint. The claim was never that like all people from a particular standpoint or position automatically have knowledge or epistemic or moral authority, but rather that different perspectives and positions within the social structure might make different kinds of knowledge possible, and that we should like consider that in attempting to come to a more adequate comprehension. So I like that a lot because I think I those of us who have been in classrooms and in some political active spaces, that deference thing is a real problem oftentimes.
Yeah, I was just going to add, because it seems to me something that's really striking in the type of work that you're doing, not just in the 4 pieces that we've read, but in other things that you have written and said. I think most recently you had maybe an interview with The Atlantic where you had this line that stuck with me, which is, at some point you have to do politics yourself. You have to be willing and able to make your own judgments. So with the Jesus reading that you did, so you say, she writes that she doesn't think that Brazil is a racist country, but what's clear from the way that you're writing this and the how the risk is distributed in that society, that Brazil is a racially stratified country, and so it's not like you say, well, I guess what can we do? I guess things are all right in Brazil, and it's just like really strange that disproportionately black people are the ones bearing the brunt of the risk distribution. No, you make a judgment. You're saying, well, this is how she is seeing it, but we can still describe these broader structures. And I think that that's a really interesting contribution you're making, which is politics is hard, and so we have to like balance these values of lifting up voices, but we also will have to know at some point we have to make our own judgments. We have to, make our own contributions, make our own insights.
Can I ask a question about where this is all coming from? Because I feel like you all in the past probably couple years, Actually, maybe since Bernie's campaign in 2016, it's become increasingly clear these sorts of debates have taken some time to crystallize in my mind, and I'm just wondering what you all think like the social basis for them is. So like I really I love the vibification phrase, but the idea of no redistribution, just vibes. To me, there's like a benign version of this where there's like people who are kind of coming to political consciousness, and I sort of call it like radical liberalism. We're just like sort of against everything, and it's people figuring stuff out. And if that's where you're at, then like I'm pro continuing to vibe until you get to the point of redistribution as well. But then there's also, I think, a clear mainstreaming of radical liberalism among the professional class, the media elite, and in fact in the Democratic Party, that's actually been used against the left to argue not just like you're coming to consciousness to like want redistribution, but also we're going to discourage you from thinking that this is important. And I think it, for some reason, to me, I used to always give the benefit to like the vibing contingent when I was like an undergraduate and a grad student, because a lot of these debates actually felt confined to the left, like they felt confined to also the academic left. And I used to take for granted that even if I disagreed with people politically or theoretically, that there was kind of like, there was a side that we were all on. And then at some point I stopped thinking that, because it felt like that whatever the elite capture went beyond just like professors in the classroom. It became fully mainstreamed into like, this is high liberalism now. And so now we're having these debates about like, addressing the content of people's arguments as opposed to just their identity. And to me, it seems to be this like disaggregating of like what once we could take for granted as kind of being on the same side politically, and maybe that was a symptom of being in a subculture as opposed, and once things get mainstreamed, then it's like, well, it's not enough to just like read these authors. Like if like CEOs are like recommending these reading lists to their employees, like we can't like amplifying voices is no longer, it doesn't have the same ring. And then this is the kind of the end of my train of thought. It became clear to me that needing to think for myself was something that I didn't used to think when I could take for granted that the people around me, we were all kind of vibing together. But then when my vibes clashed with other people's vibes, I was like, shit, I have to have my own analysis. Otherwise, I'm like just a jellyfish in this like pool of ideology. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense to you guys. That was my trajectory.
Yeah.
No, that made sense to me. What I sometimes I see going on is we talk about this a lot on the podcast, that the left and left thinking has been historically weak for a very long time. And we're dealing with what happens when it starts to break out into the open, and we haven't had like a robust public sphere to kind of hash these things out and figure out what we want to do. And so the question I'd like to ask you all, and Femi in particular, what do you see as the role of working through these ideas in the public world to, I gather, what you think we need, which is base building? How do these two things relate? Because I think what we're finding is that we're not all on the same page, and I don't know, we don't have the practice of how do we communicate with one another? How do we start to talk about these immensely complicated questions from the local up to the structural and back down again? What is the relationship that you see between those?
I was just thinking while Lillian was explaining this, one, that maybe we need a theory of vibes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was just the same thought. I was just thinking that. We're coming close to articulating a unified theory of the vibe.
Okay. Yeah. I can rock with that.
Pelly Greetster for this. But I was thinking it was just how relatable what Lillian was saying was. Because I remember back during, this feels like forever ago, but it wasn't that long ago. But I had come to start thinking the elite captures these sorts of thoughts, and I was like, oh, how bad is this, right? Like, how much does this structure how we talk about things, whether mainstream or even on whatever the left is, right? And then Hillary Clinton dropped that, if we dismantled the banks tomorrow, what would that have to do with racism? And I remember hearing that
still
line.
Be racism. So, Goldman
Right.
Sachs, come on in.
Right.
Yeah.
What does baking have to do with racism? And then, like, that was the moment I realized how out of touch I was, I feel like. Because I was expecting that to be, I wasn't necessarily expecting, just any arbitrary random person to, like, get what was wrong with that. But I was expecting, like, more. I was expecting that to be like a scandal. I was expecting explainers. I was expecting Mark Lamont Hill to, like, spend the next 48 hours like dressing down Hillary Clinton. Like, there was going to be a special MSNBC. Rachel Maddow was going to explain how banks actually connected to the Illuminati of the 16th century, which was or whatever
A
the
nice
fuck.
like 20-minute intro, and then you're like, what is this about? Like, well, this is gonna tell you how banks cause racism. Like, what?
And none of that happened. Everyone was just like, oh yeah, what do
It's like,
banks
yeah,
have to
that's
do with
true.
this?
Yeah, they're disconnected.
And I was just like, oh wow, this no redistribution, just vibes anti-racism is immensely more powerful than I had realized. And besides just base building, I think there's a real need to kind of deal with that as its own kind of political trajectory.
Well, this could maybe get at some of Will's question, right? You were asking, Will, what's the relationship between this sort of theoretical work that we might want to do or might think that we're capable of doing and this sort of political base building work? And one of the things might just be like developing models of like analytic clarity or descriptive analyses that reveal the necessary inadequacy of sticking just to vibes, right? And so, like, what is it about a purely vibe-oriented politics? What does that actually accomplish in material terms? And I think, the five of us in various ways are committed to it being radically inadequate. But in order for it to be clear why it's inadequate, we need to, articulate these frameworks, try to, as you said, Femi, earlier, like try to figure out how to articulate these systems and how they relate to one another. Like, it's important that you name it racial capitalism, for instance. Right?
Well, and also like how we relate to them politically, because, the vibes position I feel like is easier to criticize than some of the other positions that I think that I don't want to say come out against, because I feel like you're trying to push us in a different direction rather than to, in a kind of negation sort of way, fight against all these other positions. But at the end of your piece on policing, or power over policing, I think it is, you make your position on something like redistribution really clear, which is that we shouldn't be making demands for redistribution from those that are in power, but we need to focus on building power itself, right? It's the difference between, trying to exert pressure on the police versus having control over how policing is done. It's the difference between asking for more resources to be distributed to your community versus having control over how those resources are distributed. And I just want to read really quickly what you say here, because I love this. You said, the problem with policing is power, not prejudice. All of the possibilities for real, lasting, and meaningful change are downstream of community power. Until we demand and organize for power itself, rather than pleading for those who have it to take the actions we'd like, we'll never get it. I think, when we say, vibes, no redistribution, just vibes. Is that, sorry, I don't think I'm getting it wrong, but
Get it right, Owen.
Yeah,
okay,
come on. This is a
Slogan.
great slogan. Yeah.
It's not just that we want redistribution. I think there's a stronger argument in your work, which is that it's not just that we want redistribution. We want control over those distribution and redistribution networks. And I was wondering if you could say something about that distinction in how we relate to redistribution as an aim.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things that's so that's so fundamental to how I think about politics that it's actually really difficult to kind of walk through, well, why is it the case? It's like, well, what do you mean, you think, right? I guess one thing I could say is that the cues I'm taking here are from African materialist left from 50s to 70s, right? If you look at the explanations for why their resistance to the global system took the form of national independence movements, it's not because for most of the people I'm referencing, right, your Cabrals, your Nkrumahs, it's not because inclusion as a state in the international state system, inclusion as a member nation of the UN, it's not because that was the horizon, right? It was a strategic intermediate step on the way to a larger renegotiation of power, a larger global redistribution, right? As long as these people control, as long as the Portuguese Empire controls whether or not we get food, we are continually going to get famines, as India saw, as Cape Verde saw, as Guinea-Bissau saw, right? India was under the British, obviously. But the idea was we have to take control over this to have a base to stand on for which to, first of all, control some local distributions, but secondly, and perhaps most importantly, to win this larger battle over how it is that we can coexist on the same planet on relations other than domination, which are built into the imperial state system and the colonial version of a political order. And so the connection between power over distribution networks and distribution was just, they were equivalencies essentially for this generation of activists. And I think the decimation of the left, the global left, as part of the Cold War, has left its ideological imprint on the completely, to me, to my eyes, to my ears, fantastical presumption that we could possibly separate these things that kind of pervades center-left politics in the global north today, and quiet as it's kept in the global south as well, right? But it's all pressure. Pressure politics isn't instrumental anymore. It is the horizon of left politics, because nothing else is even conceivable, given that there has been such a wildly successful effort by the capitalist powers that be to end history, as the famous book put it, right?
Yes. Wait, which famous book are you talking about? Are we talking about Hegel, or are we talking about
Phenomenology of
Fukuyama?
Spirit.
You got a lot of famous books, History is over.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad you did that, because this doesn't always happen in organic conversation, but I think this comes back to the battle against doom and gloom. And I want to ask you two questions about this. One, when I was reading your piece, I don't know, sometimes the numbers, they still shock me, because sometimes I don't think I know the numbers, but it was something like 83 black men for 100 black women aged 25 to 54. That's the ratio in the non-incarcerated population. 68% of black male high school dropouts since 1970 have prison records. So, my two questions are this. So what do you think is the importance of understanding, I don't want to call it historical lineages, because again, I do worry about the sort of let's go back to the vivification of history, and we've talked about this a bit, like, slavery is the original sin or something like that, which can kind of covers over the modulations, the recalibrations, the reasons why these types of hierarchies rearticulate. So one, what do you think is important about understanding the history? Because for me, I was like, when you put the numbers raw like that, I didn't realize how bad the damage was. And two, more prospectively, why do you think it's important not to have the sort of doom and gloom, especially when it comes to climate, when it comes to what politics we are trying to build? So I guess my first question is more about, some of your reparations work. I gather you do think it's important for us to understand, past relations and all of that, not to get stuck in there. But why is it important not to get trapped in the doom and gloom when it comes to future politics? I have my own answers, but I'd like to hear what you think about it. Because one might think, if you look at history, that will cause nothing but doom and gloom. That will cause you to think, well, what can change, and et cetera. But I guess that's not where you would go.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think the last thing you said is exactly right? Which is, if you look at history, you see how violent these systems actually are, right? And how violent the people atop them have been to produce our political present. And yeah, in an important sense, that is sobering. But I think the other thing that we get out of looking at history is an understanding that where we're at is contingent, right? It's the result of specific things people did and failed to do, and attempted and failed to attempt to do, and so on and so forth. It's not destiny, right? You don't look at today's distribution and be like, well, I can read off of that all of the stable transhistorical attitudes of these entire populations. You don't read off of that. I'm looking at the only possible trajectory of the way that institutions could move through the future. Because when you look at history, you realize, oh, some of these relationships between groups of people are quite new, right? One thing you might realize, just to make it topical, is that the whole model minority treatment of Asian Americans is quite historically recent. They did not fuck with these people for a cool century, right? And that's just to give one example, right? None of this shit is set in stone, and it's particular ways that things go that creates our present reality. And I think the way that gets translated when we're looking at the future to having a perspective other than doom and gloom is, look, there are a lot of targets and there are a lot of goals, and we can pick between them. Maybe we can win them all. I would be the last person to say, leave that aspiration behind. But there was no reason to think in 1855 that chattel slavery was about to end. No reason at all, right? And it did. And that's another thing we get from history, right? That's not because, Lincoln decided that's what I'm going to do in 1860. That is not what happened.
Yeah, I'm done with it.
Like, you know what? Fuck the dumb shit. I'm going to free everybody.
He's like, I'm ready to be a cool guy now.
Yeah, he joined the cool team.
That's actually not what happened. Actually, it was a general strike of enslaved people that exploited the advance of the Union Army, right? That's what happened. And if we have proof that actually the course of history has been altered by people who were in bad strategic situations because they were paying attention, because they knew what was possible, we can do the same.
That's so great. That reminds me, I think often of this quote by Octavia Butler, right, the sci-fi author, who says something almost just to that effect, right, where she's like, I know that capitalism seems like this like impossible thing that will never be done with, but that's what the divine right of kings looked like not very long ago, right? And sort of keeping open that possibility for truly radical transformation to take place in spite of all of our, best predictive capacities that might suggest otherwise. There's plenty of room for hope. But I actually wanted to ask you if you could go back to what you were saying before about like pressure, politics being instrumental for a certain generation of activists, and now that sort of pressure having become like the horizon. And I was wondering if you could sort of situate your work and your thought on reparations as in relation to that.
Yeah. So that's a really clarifying question, because I think the thing that I'm trying to do with the book is to, in my mind, return reparations, or at least the kind of historically informed redistribution conversation, back to where it actually already was decades earlier in the global anti-colonial, anti-racist movement, the cool version, right?
Right.
When
And to be clear, the cool position is pro reparations.
pro reparations, yes, yes,
We vibe.
Ooh.
yes.
I need to throw out my article I was writing. Oops. Misread it.
Read the room.
And because back then there were two major power blocks: the Soviet Union and the US, right? And then the third world, which was largely non-aligned, or at least strategically claimed non-alignment. And what was up for grabs in those decades was the structure of the world in a real way, in a way that we have forgotten, right? And we've forgotten it because essentially the counter-revolution, the US and allied counter-revolution, was so inordinately successful, right? But what was up for grabs, what people were pushing at the international level, was a new international economic order. They more than tripled the number of member nations of the UN because they were so successful in beating back imperialist countries in Asia and Africa. They were going for the whole thing. And the reparations conversation now, the redistribution conversation now, sort of takes the structure of the world as a given and asks for redistribution within that. And that's obviously a thing redistribution can mean. And it's certainly better than the status quo, which will be happy to redistribute death downwards and wealth upwards. But that shouldn't be the horizon of our imagination, right? That's not what being practical is. Being practical, being strategic, is starting from what you want and figuring out what you can get. And the dramatic course of politics, especially in the US center left, is to figure out what you think you can get and then decide from there what it is that you want. And that's, besides being ass backwards, it's just, it builds capitulation into your basic politics.
Yeah, it doesn't even work.
Yeah.
Right.
I actually found that really clarifying because one of the major questions I definitely wanted to ask you while you're on the program, because you mentioned Amartya Sen in one of your pieces, and the concept and notion of justice seems really important to you. And so on the one hand, one might think justice, and given that we had Liam on, I'm going to make a quick Rawls joke. I don't mean it. Keep listening, etc. But one might think justice, okay, we don't live in an ideal world. What's the point of figuring out what a well-ordered society looks like when we have to deal with what we have here? But I take it that, at least part of what you're saying is it's important to have principles. It's important not to generate your principles only after you're like, okay, so this seems like, what it is. So what's the best we can make of what it is? And so what I found fascinating in other places where I've heard you talk about, reparations is, well, actually, let's figure out what, a reformulated world would look like. Partially, that would look like, I think I've seen you talk about this, is high emissions countries actually pay their share to clean up the mess that they made. Now, of course, one could say they'll never do that, but at least I take your point is, well, it's not about whether or not they'll ever do that, because then we can start talking about strategic politics. But if you're already starting from, well, if they'll never do that, so let's build from the status quo, at least the science that we have, that isn't even going to work in the long run. So what are we talking about here? Which brings me to the second thing I'd like to hear you say a little bit more about is, the way that you weave in the way climate politics and policing are going to converge in rather frightening ways. The reason why those are connected in my head is one might think, well, maybe we can actually just sort of modulate the institution of the police. Maybe if we can sand away its rough edges. Well, some of what you're saying, with the way you look at things through justice and saying here's where things are going to go, those sanded off edges aren't going to remain sanded off forever. That we can already see how much sense it would make. And by sense, I mean in the worst sense, the sense it would make for the police to start, becoming more militarized at the border. I mean, we are already a country that warehouses human beings, whether it's at the border or within. Do we really think that that would end? Like, why would it? Especially if the last thing I'll say is this system isn't only about distributing like production and reproduction, but it's about distributing risk. And we have seen no evidence that the ways these institutions are arranged now as a status quo are ever going to remodulate how they distribute risk, especially if things get more dire. So I know I said a lot of things there, but I felt that they were connected around what is the role of this concept or idea of justice in your political work? And how would you respond to someone saying, well, we don't live in a just world, so why do you need that?
Yeah, for me, a lot of times I say justice. A lot of times I also say the constructive view. One thing I lean on in the book is 𝙁𝙤𝙙𝙀𝙗𝙗's way of putting it, which is world making, right? So she describes the anti-colonial fighters as undergoing a project of world making. And I think all of that are just different ways of saying this same basic thing, which you actually picked up on earlier, which is just you have to do politics by yourself. You have to do politics yourself because the system is going to try to do politics for you, and you're not going to like the way that they want to do it, right?
Most likely not.
Yeah. So that's not to say make no concessions to reality. That's not to say don't be practical. That's to say something about what being practical is, which is it's not practical to let people who don't care if you live or die decide the starting point of conversation. Because they've already started it. The tendency in the global north with the strongest climate plan that's most organized is the far right. You know, while we're figuring out how we feel about climate crisis, they have been laying down an actual institutional structure for mass detention at borders. They have been fueling and funding multiple technological startups to increase their surveillance capacity at borders. They have been developing essentially the preconditions for climate genocide. So now imagine starting from a position of pressure politics. They say we're going to detain and kill 3 million people 2 decades from now. We're going to try to haggle that number down to 2. Actually, fuck that. Fuck that whole framework, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Like,
Wow. Okay. Yeah. When you put it like that, it's really fucking distasteful. Like, can I get them down to 1.5 million? Like that.
Yeah.
By the way, that's already saying I don't have a strong hand. So
Right.
fingers
Right.
crossed.
And we'll get them down there by threatening to like boycott like single-use plastic wrappers or something.
right.
Can I ask you? I know this is a question I've heard you be asked before, but I think it's something I really want to get out there because I think this is the first time in our conversation you actually said the phrase climate genocide, and we spent a good portion talking about trying to avoid doom and gloom, but I wonder if you could kind of just level with our viewers, what the actual real stakes are, like how this really all could go really fucking wrong. Because I think sometimes with climate change, it can seem really abstract. Usually the ways, especially in the United States, and you all can push me if I'm wrong about this, but in the public discourse, the conversation is usually what's going to happen to New York City or what's going to happen to Miami. And that would also be disastrous. Like, poor working class people live in those cities. They're going to be hit hardest. They're going to be hit first. They are not going to be like Goldman Sachs, having sandbags, their own generator. And by the way, just so our listeners know, another thing I learned from you, Goldman Sachs has a deal with the NYPD that almost guarantees them when they call the cops instantaneous, appearance. Like, I just want to get that out there. I had no idea. I didn't know how deep it ran. But I just would like you to say, I don't want to end on this dark note, but I think you should say a little bit about the actual reality of the possibility of climate genocide and what you mean by that.
Yeah, I let me just pour it on for a second, because we're not even really talking about a strong possibility. We're talking about the kind of logical result. If you start from the current trajectory we're on, business as usual, the current pace of emissions, and the current failures of mitigation, and the current failures of our political systems to provide non-genocidal infrastructure for the climate politics of 2050 and 2070 and the end of the century, what we're talking about is the likeliest result of our current climate trajectory. The likely result of our current climate trajectory would note a few things, and I'm going to take it full circle back to where we started, which is a focus on the African continent. Global distribution of temperature increase is not uniform, so major regions of the African continent could expect to warm at 1.5 the global average rate, up to that. That is interacting with a context, as mentioned before, in which already a quarter of the available arable land on the continent is owned under large-scale land acquisition. Already, hundreds of thousands of hectares per year of the Sahel are getting desertified, so there's a contraction in how much arable land there even is. And we're also dealing with a situation in which we're trying to go off of fossil fuels and try to move to renewable sources of energy, but there are many African nations, including some of the most populated ones like Nigeria and Angola, which derive upwards of 40% of government revenue off of petroleum because up until now, that was cool, globally speaking. So whether it's food security, energy security, or the basic pretense of a state system, we're talking about functionally a political collapse of the African continent before the end of the century. But just to keep it really real, right? That's not even talking yet about what that exodus is going to mean when they meet a militarized, hyper-technological surveillance system everywhere they try to go in order to survive. Right? This is the current trajectory of politics. And, I feel like a fucking crazy person because, as far as I can tell, this has made no impact whatsoever on global conversation, on the pace of net zero goals, et cetera, right? In 2009, one of the African climate negotiators, the chair from Sudan, was like, this 2-degree temperature target that we're setting is a joke, and the amount of money that they've provided African countries to do their part of our global climate burden isn't enough to buy us all the coffins we would need. That's how he put it. And we are, at current emissions rates, he was talking about a 2-degree temperature rise. We're on course for something like 3. So that's what we're up against. That's not even to talk about the rates of migration in South Asia, which are estimated in the tens of millions from climate displacement. That's not to talk about Central America, which is fueling the concentration camps that we already have on our southern border. That's the state of climate politics. And, I think there should be a little more hustle in our step.
Yeah, and that's why I've heard you say a vision of antagonistic security is almost singularly unable to deal with the climate crisis. That the only just way out, I'll qualify that. The only just way out is what you are calling collaborative security, where we're gonna have to actually start, really building the power and the organizations. But I take it's also important the vision of a world that would look what it would look like for us to actually share and what we need to not just survive but flourish. And if we think that it's just so we're going to get out by offloading it on the other people, I think even the deeper lesson is even those who are well positioned are going to pay for that. If it's not the end of the century, that can't be the way.
Well, the terminus of responding to this with antagonistic security is just eco-fascism, right? Which is what's clearly on the horizon already, and which really should terrify us a lot more than it has. I think a lot about what Naomi Klein writes in her book, This Changes Everything, where she talks about different forms of climate denialism. And there's something about climate change denialism. And there's something about this, like you say, it's just a logical consequence of the trajectory that we're on, but failing to internalize and onboard that really is itself a form of denying the extent of the ongoing catastrophe, and is something that I think we need to try to get better at. It's a lot to ask, I suppose, but we're not doing enough right now.
That's absolutely true. And her other book, The Shock Doctrine, I think, really makes clear that at the level of building capacity to move global political systems this way and that way, the right are not denialists.
No. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right. They're and that's the other half of really important stuff that we have in the AOME climate.
Yeah, neither are ExxonMobil or Shell. Yeah,
exactly.
They're not denialists either.
Exactly, they're not denialists at all. Yeah.
Okay, so I have to intervene here a minute because I now I'm in the doom and gloom place. So I want to.
We made it.
Yeah, this is.
I was hoping we could pull out a tailspin.
Yeah, you guys. Okay. So actually, the reason that I don't tend to think about climate change very philosophically, and I'm actually happy for the opportunity to do that with what Femi's been writing, is that. And it relates to my previous comment about thinking that there's more of an ideological left. I always knew there was no left-wing organization. That's not in question. But that there was more of an ideological left. I used to just think it was so obvious that capitalism is doing this. I genuinely didn't always see what was of philosophical interest, because I thought, if there's anything that's clear to me, and anything that should make you a socialist, and the argument on the basis of the dominant constraints and imperatives that guide human action in the world as we know it are fundamentally hostile to preserving an environment in which we can all live safely. And that I find it I've found it perplexing over time and overwhelming to look at debate about climate change, because I think the NGOification of climate change is a significant problem. And I think I just gave the benefit of the doubt to too many people or organizations or the rhetoric, because I actually find it kind of surprising that the more practical consequences of climate change aren't better known, and that the political costs aren't better known, and coming to consciousness that this is the case, or this lack of knowledge or consciousness is the case, is actually a sort of shock in it of itself that comes along with the other shocks that I've had about the lack of consensus about, for example, redistribution and its connection to oppression or something like that. And I think that what's important about what Femi is offering is some philosophical content. I love the discussion of security and freedom. And for me, that actually tied into some of my interests in republicanism. Republicans have tried to get away from the negative and positive liberty discussion. So I like the idea of putting some more normative and philosophical meat on the bones of this practical concern that sort of helps me. At the same time, I feel the despair that comes along with this. It feels like the knowledge of what needs to be done and the capacities in which to pursue a goal are just the gap between them is so vast. And then there's this basic problem that I feel like we've been touching on throughout the episode of the lack of some common sense political foundations. The anti-colonial left and the left globally in the 60s and 70s, they had, it was common sense to them that when you were talking about distribution, you were talking about power. This was the influence of the old left on the new left, if you will, and the ties have been broken. And what we have instead is this rhetoric that alludes to that. And what Adolf Reed has called both-andism, where we can do this and that, but what ends up not happening is an actual internalizing of the knowledge that like what we're after is political power, understood as the desire, the ability to not be subject to the arbitrary influence of the market. Or so like I guess what I'm coming to is it seems like we have all of these resources of people that came before us to be able to understand a different way of political thinking than the one we've been habituated to under neoliberalism. On the other hand, we have to like retrain ourselves to think politically under very changed, path dependent, but changed circumstances. And I wonder how to not, because to me that the doom and gloom arrives where I don't see that coalescing, and I start getting like existentially like really fucked up and afraid. And then it seems like if there's a more concrete way to think about moving forward. I'm wondering what you all think about that sort of list of anxieties and fears that I have.
I think that affective element is really important to reckon with.
Yeah, because that affective development, it does tell us about what we need and what we are lacking. And so much of what we are lacking is really asking, so what does it take to build organizational cooperative strength? Or what methods are going to do it? Because maybe, I don't think there's a silver bullet. And so, it's important to know that to come all the way back full circle, the vibification of politics might make it seem as if we're all just feel like we're on the same page, like that automatically, will help us lead to something. But no, we really need to start, and I've also been reading some Amilcar Cabral as well. We really actually need to start asking, so what does it mean to have strength, to have power, and what actually are the ways you build that with people? And that even comes down to interpersonal reactions. No one wants to join a group where there's like a puritanism, or it's all about, showing off how smart you are or something like that. Like, we need to get that basic thing right. And as 5 people who are more or less relatively online, it can be really despairing, because this cannot be the best we got. This cannot be the vision of how we're even going to interact with one another to try to build up some sort of social relationships that can start to do this long haul work, short term, medium term, and long term.
Yeah, and we're not entirely groping in the dark, right? Like, some of these organizations are already doing like some of this work, and I think that they can act as kind of guiding lights. I mean, I think, Femi, you refer to, I can't remember which piece it was in, but you refer to some of these organizations. The Undercommons, I think, was one of them. But I don't know, there were a number of different, there's one in DC that I think you mentioned you were a part of. Maybe just like, I know we're going on a little long here, but could you actually just say something about that organization in DC, which I was very curious about, some of the work that they're doing? Because I think this is not a question that academics can answer, right? Like, I don't think, at least in my opinion, I don't think academics are going to answer, if there were a silver bullet, it's certainly not going to come from us, right? So, or at least insofar as we, do the kinds of work that we do. So I'm curious about some of these organizations that you mentioned. There's one in DC that sounded, really promising.
Yeah, so the group I'm in DC is Pan-African Community Action. They formed around the community control over police demand in particular, and really starting to organize around that. And it does weekly political education. And so in addition to, working towards a ballot initiative around community control over police. So it really is this kind of back to basics sort of base building thing, from a larger, wider scoping political ideology, right? It's a Pan-African socialist group, but there's a concrete, practical goal, and the ideology is around that as opposed to the other way around, right? Which is what we see more often. So, when I, went to the Black Workers Center and sat in on a meeting, I was like, I got it, this is the team to join. So I feel like that group is a good one for a lot of reasons. But I think to bring it back to the wider scoping question of like, what is it that we do about despair? How is it that we move in a different way? People have people have their criticisms of the Green New Deal and the green stimulus and those sorts of things. And I agree with lots of those criticisms. But I just, I'm not that. This is gonna sound interesting when taken out of context. So I'm just not that critical of a guy, right? Like criticizing things is easy.
That's the pull quote. Oh my God.
For sure.
I don't know. This thing doesn't meet some moral principle you cooked up just now. That sounds plausible to me. Like you can sell me on that pretty easy. It's a very different question from whether or not I should support a thing, or whether or not a thing is worth doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't find the practice of criticism, at least as I find it in most academic circles, I don't find it very helpful, at least like as a kind of overall orientation to thinking. Not that like the act of criticizing is bad.
I think we understand how bad things are now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of like perfect enemy of the good sort of thing.
But what I like about those things, and the team I feel I've joined, there's a group of academics who are trying to push for this in a like fairly organized way, the Climate and Community Project, where it's just like what we're going to focus on is we're going to figure out what the good things are that we should be doing, and we're going to move in response to those. And I think there was a design studio under Professor Billy Fleming at UPenn, and they just built, the students there just built these beautiful visuals and stories about how, a Green New Deal could change the Mississippi Delta or change Appalachia, how we could get rid of this carceral infrastructure and give people unionized, dignified jobs that help people around them or whatever. And like the doom and gloom is important for lighting a fire under our asses. But like at the end of the day, I don't get up trying to stop doom and gloom or even really try to stop the far right, right? Like those people just happen to be in between us and something great, us in a much better world. And like, that's the thing that I'm fighting for. And I think that's a place we can root ourselves other than in despair and steel ourselves up for what it's going to take to build that better world.
Thank you. And on that wonderful note, that does it for us. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks, wherever you get your podcasts. So please like, subscribe, and also leave us a comment wherever you can. Follow us on Twitter at LeftOfPhil. And if you like what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/LeftOfPhilosophy. I want to join everyone. Thank you so much for coming on here, Femi, and we hope to have more conversations with you in the future. Farewell, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Take care. Thanks a lot, Femi.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.